After receiving his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, he was a researcher at the Hispanic Health Council in Hartford, Connecticut, where he directed several studies on HIV risk among people who inject drugs, and was the PI for a series of NIH-funded binational studies focusing on drinking, masculinity, and HIV risk among US-based migrant farm workers and their home communities in Mexico. And that is where Michael and I met. We met in Connecticut many, many years ago. He then worked for several years at the Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation, and that is here in California, otherwise known as PIRE, where he directed a number of federally funded mixed method studies focusing on drinking and occupational culture among blue-collar workers. Most recently, he was a tenured associate professor at the University of Memphis, where he coordinated a dual master's program in public health and medical anthropology. An author or co-author of numerous peer-reviewed publications, he also held affiliated faculty appointments at the University of Arkansas for medical sciences and Yale University Department of Psychiatry, where they have a center for AIDS research. Again, Michael, thank you so much, dear friend and colleague, for agreeing to do this, and let me turn it over to you.
Great. Yes, thank you, everybody. It's so great to see many names that I recognize and some new folks as well. So today I'm just going to be talking about the kind of both the challenges and the opportunities of large developing and administering and analyzing data from large qualitative research studies. Again, as I mentioned, this is going to be a little bit informal because the goal sort of is to get us all to talk and to think about some of these issues that are raised. And so as a result, some of the things I'm going to say maybe just a little bit, even though I promised Kim I'd be on my best behavior, some of it will be just a little bit polemical, but it's mostly as a way of just getting us to kind of engage and think more about what we mean when we talk about scale and other kinds of things with qualitative research. So basically, these are what we're going to talk about today. As I mentioned, one is talking about this, surprisingly complex issue of scale and complexity when we talk about applied qualitative research, especially, and mostly, I should say, the lens I'm using today, because I assume this is what, for those of you who do qualitative research who are in the audience, the focus is kind of on applied qualitative research and maybe health research a little bit more particularly. For people who do kind of more kind of theoretically based qualitative research, some of these issues may be different. But I'm kind of assuming that many of us are people who, do NIH-funded research or research that has a kind of a public health or other type of focus. So that's kind of the orientation that this talk is taking. So from there, I'll present kind of a case study of a large qualitative, well, it actually was a mixed method study, but we're going to talk about the qualitative component specifically of the California statewide study of people experiencing homelessness, or CASPA. And then I'll kind of talk a little bit about the approach that we use to the study design, the coding and analysis and things like that. And using this framework, which we call Mereology, and I'll talk a little bit about what Mereology is. But in a nutshell, Mereology concerns the relationship between wholes and parts, right? And so that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today. So the first thing that I guess we face when we're thinking about like the size or scale of studies is, what is the qualitative research has a particular kind of problem in relationship to scale, right? And that has several dimensions to it. First of all, qualitative health research tends to be kind of modest in scale relative to survey-based projects. We all kind of know this, right? I mean, if you're just thinking about like the number of participants in any kind of survey study, it's quite a bit larger than qualitative, and there are reasons for that. I mean, another issue, which is, of course, the issue of generalizability, right? When we think about the relationship between qualitative and quantitative, we've all seen these kind of schematics, and on the quantitative side, a strength is that there's a predictability or generalizability to it that qualitative doesn't have, right? And that's another thing to kind of keep in the back of our minds. So relatively modest in scale relative to survey or other types of projects. And so in the kind of work that we do, and typically we develop qualitative research to capture fairly kind of narrow or demarcated aspects of participants' experiences, right? How participants, for example, are engaging with a particular kind of intervention. What was after the intervention, like how did the effects hold, that kind of thing, right? So the research questions, because again, these are applied research questions, and in some ways it makes sense for these to be kind of narrowly focused. And this touches then on the issue, which we won't go over today because it's like too complex, an issue of saturation, right? I mean, if you're developing studies that are fairly narrow, when do you know that you have enough people, right? And there are ways to accomplish that. But one of the things that that we find in the literature is this tendency of trying to figure out, like, what are the smallest number of people that we need to talk to get this particular kind of result, right? So and partly that's tied to issues of budgets and things like that. That's totally external to the kind of scientific enterprise. So that, but I think there's also there's a problem sort of attached to this kind of focus on this more narrow focus on small number of participants to answer a pretty narrow question. Because targeted studies can be time and cost effective, and if the answers, if you want to use that term, the answers that you want are pretty narrow, then obviously a smaller study makes sense. But if you're doing research on a topic that's where the solutions that involve very complex, kind of multifaceted societal issues, then we're stuck with this concern about, well, are we actually getting at the underlying issues? Just to go back in history a little bit, one of this particular type of concern developed during the AIDS crisis, right, in the 1980s and the 1990s, where there was just a fundamental lack of understanding of what was going on, like in terms of people's behavior, of why is this disease manifesting? Well, how is it spreading in particular ways? And so there was this brief period, and Kim is aware of this because she was also part of this work, where a lot of resources were put into to mostly qualitative and ethnographic studies to try to understand sexual risk behaviors or drug use behaviors, to try to understand the mechanisms by which this disease was spreading. And this is just to underline the fact that we all know this, right? Social roles are very complex, they're multifaceted, and they tend to be saturated with meaning, often meaning that's hard to quantify. Now, in quantitative research, often this kind of complexity and messiness or murkiness is often kind of considered noise, right? But in some ways, as qualitative researchers, we need to be attentive to this kind of thing. I mean, because it seems to be the case, I think, that again, the way that we have these qualitative study designs in kind of public health settings is again, if we're demarcating and trying to answer a fairly narrow question, then we run the risk of that kind of quote noise also being epiphenomenal, when it really may be the kind of key issue around a particular phenomenon. I told you I was going to be a little bit polemical here, but but again, this is just to kind of prod people to kind of think and talk about some of this stuff. So yeah, so I guess the question then before us is, as qualitative or mixed methods researchers, what do we lose when our study designs don't take adequate account of complexity, of social complexity, political complexity, relations of power, etc.? So one solution, of course, is ethnography, right? And for those of you who are qualitative sociologists or anthropologists or others out there, you know that ethnography has been around for a very long time. And at least in anthropology, because I'm an anthropologist myself, prior to the 1960s, there was this kind of model which was called ethnographic holism, right? The idea that like you would go into like this kind of prototypical community. You would spend like 2 years there. You would like document the way they design their houses and like their kind of like political systems. And I mean, so you kind of account for some degree for like as much of the totality of experience as possible in that community. In the 1960s, of course, there was this, with good reason, kind of a critical turn in anthropology, and which manifested in people, because then there's this issue of authority and authoritativeness, like who is it who decides like what is the totality of a particular experience. But one of the things I think that maybe we lost a little bit in that critical term, which again I think made, from political and other point of view, scientific point of view, it made sense, but the idea of holism being something that's naive, or something, or that holism is something that's not something that's desirable to at least strive to achieve. And as we know, applied public health research is modeled after biomedical research, right? So, it's hypothesis-driven, generally, kind of, and again, it's relative demarcated type of data collection and analytics cycles. And the way that some of this stuff gets manifested in qualitative research is through interview studies, right? I think that generally speaking, that's, for us, that's the coin of the realm. I mean, yes, there are qualitative public health studies that do ethnography, and I know folks who are doing that, but I think generally speaking, if you look at like in terms of the N, in terms of the number of people doing that work, qualitative interview studies are really kind of how is the most dominant kind of form of data collection, I think, and that's true. And this will be the case in the case study I'll be talking about it in a minute. And even though in interview studies they don't tend to be hypothesis driven per se, but they do, and again, a lot of this has to do with maybe like how grants are written and things, is that you write the kind of research questions in a way that have a kind of a hypothetical frame to them, or hypothetical orientation, which again may, for a certain type of research topics, may be perfectly appropriate, but for others, again, that are more complex, it makes you wonder whether there might be other ways of thinking about this stuff. So what we want to try to talk about, I think, or figure out is how can interview studies aspire to provide a more holistic understanding of people's lived experience, basically. Again, with the kind of centrality of whatever the topic is, right? So we're not going, what I'm not advocating is that we go back to like the days of like Malinowski or Boas, Franz Boas, and like, go into a community and just hang out for 2 years. Well, actually, that wouldn't be so bad, but nobody's going to pay us to do that, is the problem. But I'm not advocating that. But what I am advocating is to see whether we can use the tools that we already have, interview studies, to try to strive towards a more holistic understanding of people's experiences. So I want to talk just a little bit about this term mereology. So mereology, as I mentioned in the beginning, it's a framework for understanding relationships between parts and wholes. Now, this type of inquiry has a very long history. The pre-Socratic philosophers were really interested in this issue of the relationship between wholes and parts, mostly in terms of matter, right? But Aristotle wrote an entire manuscript on holism and the relationship between parts and wholes and so forth. And so it's been going on for a long time, and in fields like mathematics and, well, certainly in social science as well, this concern or almost obsession with what is the relationship between things and their totality is an important kind of topic of concern. So yeah, so again, so what Mereology is focused on is understanding like how different parts of a thing interact with each other, and how or whether they form a whole. So if you think about how Mereology would play out in a social, scientific, or in a humanistic even type of inquiry, the idea is then to facilitate analysis of the relationship between different domains of people's lived experience, right? Because people have, we all pass through and occupy different types of places and positionalities within particular groups. Again, so the idea here is to illuminate complex social issues. And in some ways, I mean, this is a little bit of going back to what I was talking about, this kind of, maybe it's a myth of ethnographic holism, right? Of the idea of really striving towards illuminating social issues by trying to understand as many of the constituent parts as possible. So what I'm going to talk about now is just to give just a case study of this, and whether this is the best example of it or not, I guess we can talk about it. But this is one approach that we use to try to get at this particular issue. So, in starting 2 years ago, right when COVID was starting to lift a little bit, the Benioff Homelessness and Housing Initiative instituted this study called the California Statewide Study of People Experiencing Homelessness. So this is the largest study focusing on this topic since at least the mid-1990s. So this is a mixed method study, as I was alluding to before. And so the total N for the study was 3,197 participants. And this is those participants were a representative sample of people experiencing homelessness throughout the state of California. And so as you can see on the right, we divide, I don't want to get too much into the sampling thing because that's not really what this study is about, but we selected kind of representative counties, and in a way that, using a lot of kind of big math that's above my pay grade, that represent each of the regions of California, and then when we did that, we randomized participation in the study. We randomized locations, and then we randomized people within those locations, that kind of thing. But the part of it, this study that concerns us here, was the qualitative component of the study. So when we initially developed it, I think, I mean, I wrote the kind of qualitative protocol in the proposal, and and originally my idea was like, well, I mean, we should have a qualitative part. Maybe we'll just interview like 40 people and be done with it. But then, like, as I step back, it was like, well, but number one, like, what is the topic? And number two, like, in a study this large, like, okay, what is interviewing at 40 people about being unhoused? Like, what is that going to tell us about anything? So this was a pretty concerning issue, because it seemed like we were presented with this very unique opportunity. I mean, we already knew we were going to have this large survey sample of folks from which we could gain participants for the qualitative component. And so it really forced us to think in a different way about what is a study, what is the relationship between studies, and things like that. So we ended up with 365 qualitative interviews throughout the state. So what I want to talk about then is going back to this issue of like, well, what is the scope of the qualitative portion of this study? Because again, originally we were thinking, well, we'll just have a qualitative component. I mean, that's how hard is that? But because the topic we were, even for the search, not even, I mean, but the topic just in general was very exploratory. We were asking about different dimensions of people's experiences in the survey. It seemed important to us to account for that in the qualitative component as well. So we have, the way we think of it is we have this one study called, the Qualitative Study of Homelessness in California. But the way we went about it, rather than thinking about it as one study, is we thought about it in terms of sub-studies that form part of this. And this is, I guess, the Mereological component to it. And so then the trick or the question was, assuming that what we're getting at are kind of complex and multifaceted and exploratory issues, what are the kind of domains that would be the most salient? Just to explore qualitatively. In some ways, pragmatically, we use some of the same domains that were in the survey, and there was a lot of deep conversation for the survey component about what are the things that we really want to know about what it's like to be unhoused in California. And so some of that was following, or it developed in concert with the survey piece, but also it was just from kind of a broader sense of trying to see, like, if we added a bunch of these different categories together, that how close would that get us to understanding things in a holistic way? Now, I should say that, so we know this is like mereology, like which we were just talking about, but I should say that there's a caveat, and that's, the way we use mereology is a heuristic, right? I mean, because it's naive and kind of grandiose to assume that we can kind of encompass the totality of people's experiences. So basically, we used our kind of best guesses at some of the topics that are of interest, right? So I'm not going to kind of go over each of these sub-studies in detail. You can kind of see them here, but we knew going in that understanding that the challenges people face about getting rehoused was going to be an issue. Behavioral health we knew was going to be important. The reasons why people become unhoused in the first place. Later on, we added an incarceration study because it was very clear early on that, like, not a small part of people's experiences was either being incarcerated or just like the constant surveillance by the police. And so we wanted to account for that. And of course, intimate partner violence as well. Because of the unique characteristics of people leaving their home and that kind of thing. We also decided that it was important to understand in terms of people's kind of positionality, like what are the impacts of being Black or being Latinx on homelessness, right? And and we can go into the reasons why those things were chosen. I mean, in a nutshell, even the Black population of unhoused people in California and elsewhere is completely overrepresented, like relative to the percentage of Black folks in California as a whole. In the Latinx population, that the homelessness has been growing, even though for a long time it wasn't particularly high, and probably some of that was underreporting. But what we've been finding is that fairly dramatic increases in the last few years, and so some of it was trying to understand that as well. So you can see, if you look at these studies, so here are you can see the objectives. Within each study, we had certain kind of conditions. For most of them, anybody qualified, except for ones that were, for the most part, for the majority of them, anybody qualified. But we created conditions within them so that we can compare people based on certain characteristics. So just as an example, the barriers to returns to housing. We were interested in how similar or different people who have low levels of behavioral health conditions are impacted or challenged to return to housing versus people with high levels of conditions. And those conditions were based on people's responses in the survey. So, okay, so I'm kind of going over this. So each of these studies had their own kind of objective. I mean, and you can see these are pretty broad, like, just to understand like what's going on, right? I mean, we didn't really have a particular kind of research question per se, but we were just trying, and a lot of it, as you can see, to understand, because it turns out that, I mean, if we step back, I mean, because this was a policy study, and the rhetoric and kind of common misunderstandings around homelessness are so vast. And not only are they're vast, but there's a certitude. Everybody has an opinion about the causes of homelessness and what happens, and they're absolutely sure that their answer is the right one. But it turns out that there's very little data. There isn't a lot of data around it. So this study in a whole was an attempt to account for this, and the qualitative components here were to see how these complexities play out kind of on the ground. So here, so we had different objectives, as I say, different kind of conditions for each of these things, because we had these, again, we wanted to try to do some kind of comparisons within them, and you can see the ends here. So the idea then is that in theory, each of these sub-studies can serve as a standalone study. If we wanted to look at precipitants incarceration, for example, we could just focus on that, and but we could also compare them. But then in order to be able to do,
Michael,
yeah.
can I just interrupt you to
Oh, yeah,
ask?
please.
Can you say something about the interview, the content of the interview guide? Because I'm imagining that when I guess I just need to know was there a set of questions asked
Separate
uniformly
ones.
to all, or did
Oh,
and
great.
had
Yes, of course. Yeah,
the section that
that's
was
an
about
important part.
incarceration?
Yeah, that's an important part that I should have mentioned. So
And
yeah,
how
so
did you deal with intersectionality?
Yeah, so each of the interview guides, or each of the interview guides for each of these sub-studies had their own interview guides. In some cases, there were some overlap between the questions, but on the whole, they were different. I should say, just to step back a little, is that we had a lived expertise advisory board that we consulted pretty heavily with in both the survey and the qualitative component. And so each of those interview guides were vetted by people who had lived experience with homelessness. But yeah, they tended to be the questions themselves tended to be unique, but we learned quickly that people didn't want to compartmentalize their lives in those particular ways, right? And so if we did an interview that was, quote, a behavioral health interview, people would almost always talk about the reasons they became unhoused, right? Which is, and this is what we're going to try to get at in terms of the data management and coding is having these separate studies and then try to see how they can communicate with each other analytically.
And then just a clarifying question from Liliana, who asks if there's overlap in participants in the end.
Well, so there weren't, because the way it's the way that kind of worked on the ground is that, so we would go to a place, whether it's an encampment, a shelter, or some other place, and we would have people do a survey, and then some people, based on their survey responses, we would ask to do a follow-up qualitative interview, and that we would do it the same day. In fact, usually like right after they shoot the survey, we would do the qualitative interview. But for the survey and the qualitative part, we only interviewed people once. So it wouldn't be possible for somebody to be in two different qualitative studies, because they really had only one shot at a qualitative interview. But thank you for asking that. Does anybody else have any questions before I go on?
Gwen is asking, it's my understanding that some folks develop behavioral health issues after they lose their housing, especially substance use. Is that something you found in your study?
100%. Yeah, 100%. I mean, yeah. I mean, yeah, we could do an entire lecture. In fact, I think Ryan Assoff is here, who's actually knows more about this material than I do. But yes, I mean, it runs the gamut, right? I mean, just to simplify, I mean, yes, some people had pre-existing kind of behavioral health or substance use issues that caused homelessness. But we find a lot of ways in which either people's mental health deteriorated as a result of being unhoused, their substance use became more extreme as a result of being unhoused. And so the stereotype of people entering into homelessness because they're all crazy and they're all using drugs is not, it really isn't borne out by the data very clearly, right? I mean, again, for some people that there is that trajectory, but the experience of being unhoused itself is a risk factor for deteriorating mental health issues, worsening kind of substance use types of problems, etc. Okay, should I go on, or is that another question? Okay.
Yes, thank you.
So I guess So, you know, we all know, as qualitative researchers, we know that a lot of the kind of deep thinking about what it all means is on the back end, right? I mean, of course, we're doing interpretation throughout the entire process, when, you know, when we're interviewing people, when we're even developing the interview guide. But it's really like once these interviews are completed, or while they're being completed, that some of the kind of deeper thinking takes place. So just to kind of give you a very brief overview of like what we did with all the stuff, because, you know, 365 interviews, that's a lot of words. So the way we did it is well, for those of you who use deduce, we use the descriptor function. In vivo, it's called classification, but in a nutshell, that means that we like attached labels to each interview, you know, and those labels contained like information on which sub-study they were from, demographic characteristics, what county the interviews took place, etc. So one of the things that we had to decide about is like, okay, we have 7 qualitative sub-studies. Should we have 7 coding manuals, or should we try to have one coding manual to rule them all? And number one, I mean, I think the labor for first thing was like 7 coding manuals is a lot of work. But I think the more important issue though is that because the topics that people talked about overlap so dramatically, and again, because this is the people don't, you know, it's just worth reminding ourselves, people don't think of their social worlds in these narrow ways. They encompass multitudes. And so it made sense for us to develop at the end a single coding manual for all of the sub-studies. So strategically, there are, one of the things we did was we used very broad coding categories. It was one way that we used to, number one, to keep the number of codes down, because we all know that these enormous coding manuals are a problem, but also to having the categories be broad enough that they would encompass people's experiences across these different sub-studies. So like we started off with substance use, right? So if somebody's talking about, you know, cigarettes, or somebody's talking about alcohol, or somebody's talking about methadone, or I mean, excuse me, methamphetamine or whatever, then it's all substance use. With the idea that later on we could go back and then more narrowly code, and that we've been doing a lot of that subsequently. And so then what we would do is we would rely a lot on kind of co-occurrence types of analyses. In other words, looking at when one code and one big code, another big code are used in combination, and using that partly just as an analytic tool, but also to generate kind of post hoc child codes. So the advantage of this kind of approach of having a single analytic structure for all of these sub-studies is that then you can look at it gives you more flexibility in terms of level of analysis, right? So for example, you might have a question. So what are the barriers that prevent people experiencing homelessness from accessing housing, excuse me? And so one option is like, well, we did a sub-study on that. We can just look at the barriers to rehousing sub-study and get important information about that. But what if you were to ask a question about, if you're interested in the housing barriers that are faced by Latinx folks who are experiencing homelessness? So one way you could do that then is to look at 2 studies together, right? We could look at the barriers to rehousing one and the Latinx experience and see what that comes up with. The third thing, which is actually the approach that we've been using most frequently, is doing analyses across all of the sub-studies for a particular topic, right? So if you wanted to say like, well, how are the homelessness experiences of Latinx folks similar or different than other people experiencing homelessness? You could then, excuse me, look at all of the sub-studies together. So again, the idea then is that you have kind of different levels that you can draw from. You know, some focusing on a kind of fairly narrow topic, and then or you can compare different types of groups, or you can put the lens out and focus on all of the sub-studies simultaneously.
Michael,
Yes.
question from my colleague, Willie. Hi, Willie. Thank you for this great question. Willie says, having a lived experienced advisory board, question mark, seems critically important for shaping an investigation that is relevant and produces accurately and usefully representative findings and discussion. Were these perspectives / voices invited into the analysis / discussion phases as well?
Yeah. So yeah, they were. And so the way we worked is that, they consulted with us prior to carrying out the research, in terms of like the kinds of questions asked, et cetera. Some of them, depending on the county, some of them accompanied us into the field, as kind of gatekeepers. And then more on the back end, as we were doing analyses, we like on the qualitative side, we were sending kind of summaries of kind of output of things to them to review and including kind of what we consider to be kind of representative quotes of a particular topic. And so, and also, right now we're doing we did a major kind of report that came out, I don't know, several months ago, and now we're doing reports on different dimensions of our kind of research. And we're doing, of course, peer-reviewed publications. And in all those enterprises, we have folks from our lived expertise board listed as co-authors. And they've actually been doing presentations, at national conferences with us and so forth. So yeah, it's really important for us to, at all stages of the research, to have those voices included, and not just as an issue of representation, but also because their perspectives are really valuable for us figuring out and understanding what it is that we're seeing in the data. So yeah, thank you for that important question.
Great, go ahead.
Okay. So this gets back to this kind of mereological research design that we used for this particular study. And so just to kind of more, summarize, right? So, and again, as I mentioned before, this is a heuristic approach, right? And you would have to have like hundreds and hundreds of sub-studies to really try to come close to encompassing the full experience of particular group. Like, we've been kind of kicking ourselves, for example, of several different sub-studies that we could have, should have wanted to do, but we didn't do. I mean, a sub-study on aging, for example, or on youth homelessness. Yeah, so there were a number of things that we didn't actually dedicate standalone sub-studies to, although we still have data on a lot of that material, just because, again, people across the sub-studies would talk about those particular issues. But even though it's, again, so it's impossible to capture the totality of people's experiences, there is, it is worth thinking about whether there are ways that we can kind of nudge our own work forward to try to take more nuance into account, or more dimensions of people's experience. So like in the CASPA study, for example, so each of these sub-studies, they generated new thematic material, but that was not explicitly, it wasn't explicitly included in their respective interview guides, right? And so, one of the things that we did, like, for example, we had one of our studies that talked about, we had a study that talked about the reasons people became unhoused, and we have another study of why they remain unhoused. And one of the things that, for me, that's super interesting, and we have a paper that we're hopefully going to get out pretty soon, is the issue of employment, like how it is that job loss precipitated homelessness. And so, we didn't ask any questions about people's employment in any of these studies, but of course it just emerged as something that was super important across these dimensions. Another thing is the role of pets, that in people's decision making around where they're going to stay and what they're going to do. Just very briefly, I mean, there's a lot of rhetoric around why people don't just go into shelters and why do people prefer to camp, right? And or live out on the streets and so forth. And a lot of it is because of, well, there's a lot of reasons, but one reason is because of people's dogs or pets. those are like their most important relationship for many of them, and they provide protection and other kinds of things. And so if shelters aren't allowing animals inside, then that decision is made. There's no way that they're going to give up their pet just to sleep in a bunk someplace. Another piece, this was sort of interesting that we added like a little sub-study to. So a lot of folks, as you know, live in their vehicles, like whether they live in campers or their cars, etc. And so because we found quickly that their situation and perspectives were just different than others. So what we would do is if people indicated to us, either in the survey or the qualitative part, that they lived in their vehicle, that we had like 3 or 4 questions that we would ask, regardless of the sub-study that they were enrolled in, about the particular dimensions of being a vehicle resident, right? Getting your car towed, or like what happens if you get ticketed, and those kinds of things. So as you can imagine, there are a lot of limitations in doing this kind of large scale work, right? I mean, you have to have sort of a large sample size. I mean, it's kind of an interesting or open question. If I've often thought about, like, if you were to do a more modest version of what we proposed, I mean, in theory, I guess you could just have 2 sub-studies, and maybe that would result in having a smaller number of participants. But generally speaking, you have to have a larger sample size than the norm. And as you can, what I've been trying to get at, I think, is that these kind of studies are most impactful when the subject is really exploratory and broad and multifaceted. Because again, we didn't really go in to this project with the set of hypotheses per se. I mean, we were like, we just want to know like as much as possible about different dimensions of the experiences of people who are unhoused in California. If we were going in to talk about, like, we're really interested in like service delivery and utilization, then this study would make a lot of sense for a study like that. But I hopefully I think that there are some benefits to at least consider for certain types of studies. One, of course, is triangulation. I mean, yes, because it's a mixed method study, we had triangulation between the survey component and the qualitative part. But this gave us, maybe this is it pentagonal, or maybe it's not a triangle, it's like an octagonal, because we were able to kind of do triangulation between sub-studies. I mean, because if it's the case, and there's maybe I guess it was Kim who made the important question about, well, the questions you're asking people are different depending on the interview guide, but if those same topics come up organically in other studies, then that kind of gives us more confidence that what we're seeing in that particular sub-study makes sense. It also foregrounds social complexity, which, for some topics is really important to kind of understanding just what is going on with folks. And, it can provide kind of more of an in-depth, multi-dimensional accounting of the lived experiences in particular populations. And so in some ways, at least vaguely analogous to an ethnography. I mean, an ethnography is different because it's observational and there's a time dimension to it. But these large kind of studies that, like the one that I'm talking about today, I think can get us closer to like what the types of richness that you could find in kind of ethnographic forms of inquiry. So yeah, so that's what I have. But I'm more than happy
That's
to take
all, Michael. That's all. That's amazing. Thank you so much. Host prerogative to ask a question. I know some of your interviewer team members, and I know their level of competency. And I would just love to hear you say something about the composition of the team. And I guess I would imagine that if I were running the study, I would want certain interviewers to be focused on certain communities so they knew what kind of information had come up in previous interviews and could be, just doing more iterative data collection. And so multiple questions. So were these semi-structured? Were you trying to build expertise within a particular interviewer about a particular community so that they could go off script and really continue to go further and further into areas that you didn't know you needed to go further into for a particular community, so to speak? Or did you have to just assign people randomly to different sub-studies because of the nature of the logistics and the 7 sub-studies and just the scope of the project?
Yeah, it's a great question and a large one. I mean, the logistics really did dictate to a large degree, how that shook out. And the reason for that is that so at BHHI we have 5 qualitative researchers who are kind of our core team. Many of them, because we had the number of surveys, for example, we had to do was so vast that many of them did surveys, because we would go out for a week or 2 weeks at a time to different locations. And so most days or some days people would do surveys, and then there would be a day or two where they would do qualitative studies. And we tried as much as possible to have certain interviewers focus more on certain dimensions or certain sub-studies, partly for the issue of expertise, but also the issue of representation. So, the people who did the Black Californian study were all Black folks, for example. But again, one of the things that because initially we went in with this idea that okay, this person will be kind of quote in charge of this sub-study, and this one will be in charge. But again, we found out that the content was so porous that it almost didn't matter so much. But the more important issue is that people, number one, were able to build rapport, of course. But the other issue is that they were that we were all learning together about what we were seeing and taking that with us into the field, right? And so that helped us as we went to ask better questions and to kind of focus our inquiry based on what we had already been hearing.
Got it. Thank you. I want to ask a question that Ryan put in the chat. Thanks, Michael. This is similar to a study I'm managing across 5 countries on 5 countries. Wow, on forced displacement. We structured a lot of the analysis similarly, and we have tons of data to work with. So it's helpful to hear about your process. I'm
Fantastic.
curious how you're managing the process of recoding for more specific analyses. I understand the value of coding broadly on the first pass. How do you manage coding for more specific analyses on subsequent rounds? And I just want to say we should do a session on this because I think it's something that many of us might be contending with. So
Yeah.
Michael, please take a
Yeah,
stab.
just a very broad and quick and dirty version of it is a lot of it, to be honest, is dependent on papers or reports, right? And so right now, because we are writing papers on substance use issues right now, among other things. And so we went back, I think I told you that we had this substance use code that was this big bucket that encompassed everything. So so mechanically what that means is going into deduce and identifying all the places where we coded for substance use, and then create child codes based on the kind of substance they're talking about. And people would talk about cigarettes, then we would do a child code for cigarettes. And if it was, alcohol, it would be alcohol. So that's kind of just in a very broad way, like how we've been going about it. But I'm very interested if they're easier or better ways to do that. I'm super interested in learning about that.
Andrea.
Thanks so much for such a great talk. I've been doing, the very applied, this is my end because I know I'm going to be saturated by the time I have 30 or 35 interviews. So I was super interested in hearing more about, the range of ends that you had. So did you have a very generous budget or a lot of, graduate students who funding wasn't as important? And how did you manage that?
Well, yes, we did. Yeah, our situation, to be honest, it's complex. And so at BHHI, we started with we were given a large gift from Mark Benioff from Salesforce. And so we went, and we applied for foundation funding for this project, and that the idea we thought is like, okay, we have two foundations, they'll each do a third, and we'll kick in a third. And it turned out that was way below budget, and so we just put in a bunch more money. So this is one of the limitations, right? I mean, is like in some ways we had the luxury of having this large budget that we can do this kind of thing, and we didn't face nearly as many constraints. And our constraints were more around staffing and personnel, but not so much around the budget. And so, yeah, this was unusual in that sense.
That's very cool. That's awesome. Thanks.
And Willie.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for this presentation. I unfortunately had to miss the beginning of it, but I really appreciated, as I shared an earlier question and comment, the inclusion of like the lived experience board, and hearing that they're also engaged in various parts of the process. Yeah, I feel very curious around well, one of the lenses that I was like listening through some of the language that came to mind as you were talking about triangulation, and as you were talking about like the use of lived experience advisors, this idea of what I've heard of as like a feminist methodological approach, which aligns with a relational approach, and that aligns with I've heard in Indigenous American language being in good relations, and as kind of an antithesis to colonization, dominance, masculinist, positivist, like all of these kinds of things. And I feel curious about the weight of these voices and perspectives in throughout the study, and also in discussion, particularly like when handling limitations, as you talk about like funding, like how much has that gone into, how much is that discussed with these voices, how much in the discussion are we locating ourselves within a cultural sociopolitic that has something to do with the inequity, displacement, and what we're blind to, the limitations of research, like how much is that being elevated, even in the face of, well, we got funding for this, so we're going to report specifically on this, or this is all, like that feels like a pressing kind of concern for me in both experiencing and looking at those who are historically excluded, marginalized, silenced.
Yeah, thank you for that. That's really important. Yeah, we did it. I mean, I should say, I mean, we could have a whole session on community advisory boards and that kind of engagement. But we also paid people for participating in meetings and as co-authors and so forth. But in terms of, I mean, I don't know, one of the things that maybe you were getting at also was around the funding. So this is one of these weird situations where the governor asked us to do this study, but they didn't give us any money. And in some ways, it's like, well, why should we do it? But the flip side was it was actually more important, and it's actually good that they didn't give us money, because we're really not beholden to anybody in terms of the result. As long as the results are sound, I think that's for us the most important thing. But there isn't a particular spin that we feel pressure to put on the findings, because again, the people who would be most impacted, the policymakers, really don't have. I mean, we consult with them, and we're trying to move policy, but we're not, we're not beholden to them because they gave us money.
Thank you so much, Michael. We're
Sure.
1 minute over. Thank you to the great audience. Thanks for being here. We'll reconvene in the fall, and we will certainly put qualitative data analysis of moving from big bucket coding to more finer grain bucket coding on the list, because I think it's an important way to go about coding and working with data. So let's talk about that in our 2024-25 year. Have a great summer, everyone. Thanks.